the red wine was served out, followed by whiskey and cigars for the men, cigarettes for the ladies, the writers' plans began to take shape. Month by month, book by book, they'd change how people thought about reading. As judges, their tastes would be broad and eclectic, embracing popular genres and literary fiction, as well as history, travel writing and memoir. They would not take themselves too seriously. Books should be enjoyable and for everyone. By supporting new authors and encouraging a habit of book buying, they'd break the back of the private subscription library market, enabling ordinary busy people to build their own collections of first editions.
Yeah, so I first came across the Book Society in Publishers Archives. So I was working in the archive of Hogarth Press, which is the publishing house that Leonard and Virginia Woolf set up. And there was loads of correspondence with the Book Society. And at that point, I didn't really know who they were or anything about them. And I was kind of really surprised by how much the Woolfs were kind of going along with what the Book Society was suggesting or asking for. And so kind of wanted to do a bit more work on them, really. And then when I realised that they took like 9,000 copies of the Edwardians by Rita Sackville West, I kind of realised like the scale of what the club was and why they were so important to public. I mean, it's even that's a huge amount now for a book's sales, or for most books. So it was kind of realising that they were kind of quite significant as distributors and purchasers, and that publishers wanted to work with this like new group. And so, yeah, that's how I kind of got into wanting to know more about them, really.
What was most radical about the new club was its attitude to books as consumer items to be sold to customers direct through the powers of curation, advertising, and expert opinion. To some, like socialist Margaret Cole, this meant books had joined a consumer revolution that, quote, in the course of a generation has brought gramophone records, silk stockings, foreign travel and smoked salmon within the reach of small purses. But to others, the Book Society was standardising literature and selling out. To many with a stake in the snobbish book world of the time, readers shouldn't need to be told what to buy.
By the early 30s, they had about 13,000 members, but they would put in these huge orders to publishers, which for some publishers meant they could reduce their costs a little bit. So they'd do a bigger print run. So some of the big histories that the club chose were 8 and 6 rather than 10 and 6. So kind of quite a reduction on each individual purchase price. And then, yeah, because they'd got members like through what was then like the British Empire. So they distributed to over 30 countries, apparently, in terms of their members. So it's kind of like a global readership as well. Their choices were kind of advertised in bookshops and in libraries. And so even if you weren't a member, you might have found out about them in that sense as well. And for me, I'd got like a certain prejudiced idea about particularly like the Hogarth Press and who they published for and the kind of books they did, and was just really surprised that they were so willing to work with this kind of book distribution company. Virginia Woolf had a personal relationship with Hugh Walpole, so that influenced things as well. But like her 1933 book Flush, which is a brilliant story about from like a dog's perspective, of kind of it's really cool. That was a club choice, and the press made various changes to the form of it so that it could be a Book Society choice. So they made it a bit bigger, they kind of used bigger paper, and they got Vanessa Bell to add extra illustrations because the Book Society always charged like a set amount to their members. So it needed to look a certain way as well in terms of its kind of size. So yeah, for me, that just kind of changed what I thought I knew about book selling in that period and people like Woolf. So then looked more broadly at the kind of variety of things that the Book Society sponsored. And Hugh Walpole, who was judge on the selection committee for years until he died in 1941, he had been a literary agent, so he worked for Curtis Brown for a little bit and was really struck by kind of, the number of books that are published and what what kind of fault, what doesn't get attention, and so wanted to, I think, be a part of the idea of promoting books. And he was also part of this group called the Society of Bookmen, which was publishers, booksellers, and authors coming together to try and promote books. So, well, him and the other members of the selection committee were like invested in this idea of getting books out there and bringing books to like wider readers as well. Walpole was it was a perfect choice. So he was the first choice to be head of the selection committee, and he was a best-selling writer himself who was really popular in places like Boots. He did like almost a novel a year. He wrote really quickly, but was also very invested in other people's literary careers. So in his archive, there's lots of kind of manuscripts that people sent him, like thanking him for his support, and he kind of spoke quite broadly across a range of writers as well. So when he died, there was quite a lot of there was a really horrible obituary in the Times on him, and just lots of writers kind of came to his defence. So people like T.S. Eliot and more popular writers like Priestley that he worked with directly, just kind of saying actually he wasn't this kind of like grasping popular novelist that the obituary kind of presented him as, that he was interested in like supporting and promoting other people's work as well as his own. I mean, the work for the judges was huge. They would read piles and piles of manuscripts every month before the committee meetings. So the judges were Hugh Walpole, George Gordon, who was an academic, Cecil Day-Lewis, Sylvia Lynd, Clement Stane, Edmund Blunden. They did introduce like a layer of like first readers. So the books would come to the Book Society before they were published. So they were, as kind of like professional critics as well, they were making a judgment on things before they came out and trying to spot what was the next kind of big thing. But they did have support after a few years. So they'd have like a layer of initial readers, and then things would get to the judges to look at for the meetings.
Along the way, they would gain enemies. Personal attacks and jibes about their integrity would haunt them, threatening to topple their careers. They'd be accused of dumbing down, mocked as middlemen for, quote, conferring authority on a taste for the second rate. Not all five would stick it out. But the Book Society they began that night would serve tens of thousands of readers worldwide for the next 40 years, steering a course through the Great Depression, the rise of fascism, and the devastation of World War II. Hundreds of what we now think of as 20th century classics would first reach readers wrapped in Book Society Choice yellow bands. Before Reese Witherspoon and Zoella's book clubs, there was Oprah Winfrey and Richard and Judy. And before them, there was Hugh Walpole and the Book Society. This is the story of 5 writers who shaped what we read.
It took a while to get going, so there was a lot of interest. So they advertised it in newspapers initially. So like to afford to buy 12 books a year at full price, you'd got to be like reasonably well off. It was a significant commitment. They were hardback, like first editions, so they weren't cheap books you were getting. It was part of the publisher's program, and they sold it on that front as well. The idea that you could like build up a collection of new editions. Walpole had this idea that they were catering for, he called it like the man on the street plus a little culture was his phrase. So it was people who wanted a bit of guidance, might be very busy, like they were often being like professional workers. So the readers that I know about directly were in professions like doctors or, well, one of the Book Society, there's a fictional portrait of a Book Society member in E.M. Delafield's diary, a provincial lady from the 30s. So she's kind of quite an affluent upper middle class kind of housewife with leisure to read books as well. So they catered for different types of readers, and also lots of readers living abroad or expats as well. Towards the end of the project, I was contacted by a lady in Perth who had a full Book Society collection from her maternal grandparents, and they were based in India from the 1930s to the 50s. They worked in the jute trade, and they had these books shipped out to them every month and kind of built this collection. And then when they came back to Scotland in the 50s, they brought this collection back with them. So it's that was kind of amazing to see, 'cause it's like a lifetime's reading. And as a member, you got a book plate, so they'd personalised that as well, stuck those in, then numbered the books on the spine. So that was really interesting to see. One idea for the structure I had was like whether I could do it through like a book a year, and tried to kind of map that out. But in the end, that structure just felt a little bit restrictive in terms of how I like told the story, because I couldn't put so much on each book because they're all so different. It took a long time. As far as I'm aware, there's no surviving archive for the Book Society. So initially, I didn't know which books, I didn't know how a full run of the books they'd chosen or selected, and was really working initially in like published archives. So looking at sales and trying to spot when there was a Book Society choice. There are some the members received a monthly newsletter, so there are some surviving copies of that in the British Library. So that, but not from the early years, from 1936 on. That was really helpful, so then I could start to like look at particular titles that had been selected. But what I really wanted to do in the book was like tell a kind of behind the scenes story through the judges, and think about why they chose certain books over others, and what was going on with the selections. So that made the book more of a personal story, really. So I looked in the judges' diaries and letters to try and find evidence of arguments or disputes over certain titles, and how they came to their decisions. I was really interested in that. So quite a lot of their papers and diaries are in Texas now, in the Harry Ransom Center, randomly. So I did a trip to Texas early on, where I was looking through Hugh Walpole's diaries, and trying to find like the monthly meetings and what he had to say. And in the comments in the diaries, it was just kind of like Book Society meeting, glorious. And then the next month it would be like delightful. So it took quite a long way to go to find out that they'd gone well. But then it was like looking in the diaries and like other people's papers that helped to find out more about some of the arguments. And sometimes it was like who wasn't there at a meeting meant that something got through, or someone had got a really strong opinion against something. So there were 5 of them, so they would vote. And there was a lot of pre-work with Sylvia Lynd was a real kind of mover and shaker in the 20s and 30s. She was a creative writer in her own right, but she was also involved in the Book Society and a few other kind of literary prizes at the time. But she seems there's good surviving correspondence between her and Hugh Walpole, where you can see they're like prepping each other before meetings and kind of checking about what each other thinks before they go in. So she was a really strong voice. So she's known for having these like weekly Hampstead parties with her husband, Robert Lynd, who was a journalist. And she was good friends with Victor Gollancz, the publisher. So there's, in his autobiography, there's some pictures of the parties at the Lynd's house. A really interesting family. Like her daughters were both involved with the communist movement in the 30s and anti-fascist stuff. And Sylvia as well went along to some of the rallies against the British Union of Fascists in the Royal Albert Hall in the 30s. So very interesting, like political kind of family as well. So she reviews a lot of women's writing. And when I was reading some of the reviews, so in the Book Society news, you'd get like the choice and then the review by a critic, and then you'd have other recommendations. And in a lot of Sylvia's stuff, it's about women's choices, and there's stuff about Rosamund Lemon's novels and divorces and like affairs and things. And I was reading some of those, and Sylvia herself was involved in an affair. She had quite an unhappy marriage in some ways. And she was also concerned with her daughters, and they had various kind of engagements that were broken off or didn't work out. And so she was clearly kind of thinking about the personal stuff while she was reviewing like Rosamund Lemon's novels as well. And when the king abdicates in 1936, that's also, she ties that into some of her reviews as well. So she's thinking about the wider stuff that's going on and how fiction kind of explores some of those things as well. I think Sylvia is probably my favourite read, probably because So she's not very well known still. Part of the research I did for the book was in collaboration with Sylvia Lynn's great granddaughter Lydia Syson, who's a writer, and she shared some like family papers. Um, but Sylvia is mainly known through, yeah, she was friends with Rosamund Glenman, um, and then she's known through like her husband and his work. But actually, she did lots in her own right. Um, and amazingly, some of her diaries have survived, so we could look at those. Um, and yeah, I think she's just one of these people like behind the scenes that had quite a big impact on what was happening at the time. And so the other club she was involved with was the Prix Femina Roses Anglaises, which was like a French prize where it's kind of really interesting. So a group of British women would choose a book to be translated into French for a French audience, and the same thing happened vice versa. So it was set up after the First World War to try and it's a bit of like friendship between Britain and France. But yeah, Sylvia was really instrumental in that group as well, and as a judge and a critic, she wrote book reviews for Time and Tide, so involved in lots of things, but someone who's kind of been forgotten really, and that just I found that really interesting. And just had a really colourful life in her own right. So reading the diaries, um, so yeah, Robert Lynn was a journalist, struggled with alcoholism, and the way that Sylvia kind of managed that and dealt with it, and they stayed together and supported each other. But as he got more kind of more ill, really through the Second World War, she would sometimes write some of his articles and publish them under his name still, but make sure he was kind of keeping up with his deadlines and things. So yeah, just had very interesting personal lives as well. They were very embedded in that whole idea of kind of making money from writing books, writing about them, publishing themselves, reading other people's work. Yeah. J.B. Priestley, who was one of the judges, talks about them as being like broad brows. So this idea of interested in all sorts of different types of books, so fiction, history, travel, biographies, kind of quite a wide range of things, and not wanting to be like too highbrow or kind of just like part of a literary elite, but trying to level things. That was kind of a key thing they were trying to do. I enjoyed reading books that I'd like not heard of before, and one of the authors who I really enjoyed reading more of was Mazo de la Roche, who's a Canadian author. She was a bestseller in her day. Like she, again, a bit like Walpole, she published a lot and had a huge fan base. So up to the 60s, and some of her early books were televised as well as this Jalna series. So it was really exciting finding out about her, and just really readable books. So she was an early choice who they supported a couple of times. Ian Delafield's Diary of a Provincial Lady, I really enjoyed that. That's recently been republished by Virago, and they kind of described it as being the Bridget Jones of the 1930s, and it's a really well, that was a pitch anyway, but that's a really interesting read. And the portrayal of the book site in there is quite funny. So the main character is initially a member of the club, and talks about some of the books that she's been receiving through the post, and then gradually she starts to receive more things she doesn't like than she likes, so she kind of comes away from the club. But it's kind of all ironic really, because that book itself was a book society choice, so it would have been going out to the readership. And actually Hugh Walpole does that in one of his novels as well. So he's got a character who talks about being in the book society, and another character kind of challenges her and says, well, why do you want to be in a club like that? And she says, oh, it's good to read what everyone else is reading, and I like getting, it's kind of five is better than one, so it's not as prejudiced as just hearing from one reviewer or critic. You're following the recommendations of like a group of people, but again, that's obviously very tongue-in-cheek, because Walpole's own readers of that book would have known that he was a judge, and I think it's they did get a lot of snobbery and criticism at the time, and people said they were like dumbing down, or that people don't need books chosen for them, but actually I think they were kind of pushing back on that and saying that they had confidence in what they were doing, and that people did value belonging to a club like that. So because they didn't say they were kind of like choosing like the best books, it was kind of like interesting and worthwhile was the idea. So things that it was worth spending money on or spending time on. There was a kind of element of choice in that for years, if you didn't like the main choice that had been sent to you, you could choose another book from the recommended pages. So they recommended about another 12 titles. So there is this idea that you've got an element of choice. And they kept that kind of distribution going right through the Second World War. And eventually they asked people to say if they didn't want to receive the book of the month for next month, and gave a bit of a blurb. But it's kind of interesting, I think, as a model. So debut authors, and yeah, lots of writing and translation all the way through, but yeah, through the Second World War as well. Yeah. And they had some kind of like this. Vicky Baum is one of the novelists that they do early on, so kind of quite fun, flapper kind of titles, and then you get some kind of quite serious, like political stuff. There's a Danish book by a writer called Holland, which is looking at the Italian invasion of Abyssinia in the mid-30s, and that's like a travel like report really of what's going on out there. So yeah, really varied international understandings as well. Thinking that they were reading books in TypeScript before they come out and didn't know what was going to be a hit or successful. They did spot lots of kind of major writers, so like Graham Greene, Evelyn Waugh, Rosamund Lemon. There's lots of like big names that they were part of their success. But yeah, equally there's lots of writers that have fallen out of print. So as I've been working on the book, I've found like kind of old copies through online, like kind of Abe books and things like that. There were some very obscure titles from the early years that I hadn't got in my lists, and I only found out about those when I got the big collection from the Crichtons, from the kind of Indian members. But equally, lots of books have been, probably perhaps about 3/4, I would say, are kind of in print or have been reprinted since. So in terms of like their success as like judges, they were pretty, they were professional critics and readers. I guess they had a pretty good eye for what worked. But certainly, yes, some have just fallen by the wayside. I would definitely recommend Mazo de la Roche's books, and a lot of those are back in print now. They also supported Dorothy Whipple's works, so they've been reprinted again by Persephone. But I think, yeah, I mean, I've been able to get hold of most of the books that I've enjoyed reading, kind of thing. I think, yeah, I've not got one that's there's a good novel by Nigel Balkin. It's called The Small Back Room, and he writes thriller adventure stories. That's a really good Second World War one that is still in print. That was reprinted recently, but I really enjoyed reading that one. It's kind of set in and around the Ministry of Information, and you've got this character who is kind of, they're developing new weapons, and he is involved in kind of bomb disposal work. That was, yeah, kind of quite an interesting read. He was based in the Ministry of Information, which is where Cecil Day-Lewis also worked as well through the Second World War. So he was one of the judges. So I think, and I'm pretty sure Day-Lewis recommends that one. So probably would have known of him in the novels. But that was kind of quite an interesting insight into some of those jobs created in the civil services in that time, or in kind of science. And I think one of the other really like interesting tensions that I tried to track in the book was the debates in the 30s between pacifists like Edmund Blunden and people like Cecil Day-Lewis who wanted to kind of work to kind of actively stop what was happening in terms of the kind of growth of fascism. So Blunden and Day-Lewis were both judges, and in the recommended pages, they are like offering readers or advise, kind of recommending quite different types of books. So Blunden chose quite a lot of books that were kind of more right wing. Day-Lewis is more left wing, so you get this kind of tension played out. And kind of, I mean, Edmund Blunden was a pacifist, kept up his relationships with Germany right into the Second World War in kind of quite a complicated way. So that kind of tension between different judges as well is kind of interesting in them, the books that they chose. And it's more in the recommended pages that battle is played out. But they had different views on the Spanish Civil War, and that's kind of that was kind of documented in a pamphlet where they're absolutely opposing. There's a book called Europe in Arms that Blunden recommends at one point, and then he also recommends books by a couple of politicians that are seen as being kind of quite right wing. And it looks like some of the meetings around like the Munich crisis and things were really just like heated personally between them. But I think just Blunden's pacifist position just gets very, very difficult for certainly like Hugh Walpole and Day-Lewis as they go into the Second World War. So there's a letter where Walpole kind of writes to apologise for how they've acted towards Blunden in a meeting, but then ends up kind of basically saying, I think we need to do this. And like some of Walpole's reviews, he almost echoes like speeches by Churchill. So there's a H.G. Wells novel where Walpole is using kind of Churchill's language really to say that we need to move towards war to prevent Hitler from kind of going forwards. So they're definitely using reviews in quite a political way as well.
Cecil Day-Lewis was keen on December choice, Nigel Balkin's semi-autobiographical thriller, The Small Back Room. Like Balkin's first novel, Darkness Falls from the Air, which was set during the Blitz, The Small Back Room was, quote, developed with power and persuasive skill, bound to be popular with readers. Balkin was a fellow civil servant based at the Ministry of Food, and this was an unusual novel, Cecil confirmed, about a secret war research department focused upon the dilemmas of weapons researcher Sam Rice, who is tasked with investigating a new type of bomb that German aircraft were dropping over Britain. Balkin wrote with particular insight, according to Cecil, from, quote, the bitter taste of experience in his description of the backstairs work behind the backroom boys. But more than that, the book was about compromise and ambiguity as much as heroics, the inevitability of mediocrity. Quote, the good chaps went and were killed, and the crooks got away with it. I just stayed put, is his summing up, Cecil took away from the novel. As he elaborated in his Book Society review, quote, a few go all out for the side on which the bread is buttered, complete egoist, natural opportunists. Whether they become, in the legal sense of the term, crooks, depends upon their luck too. The rest of us, the great majority, oscillate uneasily between principle and advantage, between alternatives which never seem clear-cut, between courses whose totals of good and evil cancel each other out.
The World War II material I just found so interesting because there were a lot of titles there that I'd not read before or come across. And I kind of realised as I was looking more closely at what they were choosing through the Second World War was that they kind of very much followed what was happening in terms of like the battlefields and the global politics. So when France falls in 1940, they choose a French title. They move to Russia through the Battle of Stalingrad. And then when you kind of shift to in 1942 you get like the fall of Singapore and the Japanese army kind of advancing, they choose books by Chinese authors, so it's kind of a very global story in some ways, and I think they're trying to share this wider kind of reading culture with their members as well. So they actually set up a page engaging with kind of global politics through the Second World War. So readers have got a sense of kind of non-fiction they can read, or fictional books as well. But there is, definitely a sense of trying to, I think, map or help readers navigate like this kind of really kind of complex field as well. And it was quite a long and messy process, really, because it started off more as an academic project. And then I realised that I kind of really wanted to upfront like the stories of the judges as characters, and that was quite a different way of writing. I had to do it chronologically because that kind of just works, I think, in terms of the plot. And then I think when we were talking earlier about like which books, I kind of started to, rather than doing one book a year, it was like which books can tell the best story for what was going on in this particular period of time. So that's where I used, like the reviews that some of the judges had written, where I could bring in personal and political or wider things. And then there was some moments where things just kind of fell into place. So I remember finding this, it was a pamphlet in 1937 where it's called Authors Take Sides on the Spanish Civil War. And I was looking at that and realised that Day-Lewis was on one side and Blunden was on the other. So that became a way to help tell that kind of story about what was going on in the run-up to the war. And then some of the reviews later on, like quite a lot of the book part of the book looks at the different judges' like affairs and what was going on with her love life. So Cecil Day-Lewis and Rosamund Lemon's affair in the early 40s is kind of quite a big part of his story. And I found that they do a couple of reissues in the Second World War of Tolstoy's fiction. So Day-Lewis writes the introduction to a reissue of Anna Karenina, and in the introduction you can just see how it's tied up with the affair that he's having with Rosamund Lemon and the difficulties around it and the demands they were making on each other and stuff. But he kind of puts all that into how he describes Anna Karenina's affair. So things like that helped to kind of tell those particular storylines. I had kind of spreadsheets with timelines and kind of what was going on in their lives, what books they were choosing, and then tried to tie it on round with what was going on more broadly. So things like the abdication, or earlier on some of the debates around kind of literary modernism, because they're kind of criticising that in some ways and trying to represent a wider range of books. So that was a way to tell some of the early setup material. But I decided to stop at the end of the Second World War, because after that point the club goes on to the late 60s, but you get a whole new load of judges in after 1945, and I didn't feel I could do the same kind of thing with their life stories that I'd done for this part of the time. So whenever I've done a talk, people always ask me, how did it end? And it's kind of it's a whole other story really, and you've got public libraries and just not wanting this kind of guidance in the same way, but obviously now it's kind of come back again in some ways. And the Book Society, I didn't say they did actually, so it was, it's a mail, something that comes through the mail, and they didn't necessarily meet in person, but they offered the idea that you could meet in person. They had this fancy premises in London. They call it Book Society House, which is the back of Buckingham Palace, and there was adverts in the Book Society news of these kind of club rooms that you could go to. And again, that would be quite unusual for men and women in that period to be able to go to these kind of fancy spaces. So we don't know how many people went there, but I guess the idea that was on offer would have been quite appealing as well. They've got a page in the magazine called The Members' Rooms, and there you get people writing in and saying like, I particularly liked this choice, or I didn't like that one and stuff. So you've got a bit of a dialogue and community going on as well there. So it was a limited company, so it was set up by a small group of kind of newspaper men, financiers and publishers who were interested in promoting books, and they asked Walpole to front the club. he was asked to set it up in 1928, and he died in 41, so he was still working for it then. Sylvia Lynd worked until the 50s on it, so over 20 years. J.B. Priestley went and came back and did a lot of work for it after the war as well. And the judges were paid to read and review all these books that were coming in. But yeah, I mean, I think for them as well, it helped to kind of cement their kind of influence as reviewers and critics, and most of them stayed for a long time, like over several years. So I guess, you know, it's you're part of a group, you're reviewing books monthly to a wide audience, so helpful for like professional critics as well, potentially.